America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Welcome to episode 4 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Melso, and today we are continuing our conversation with Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the book, Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. In the last episode, we discussed the enduring value of our Western civilization, of what the ancient Greek and Roman traditions espoused regarding property ownership rights. We discussed how that regard gave rise to constitutional governments, social equality under the law, unconstrained economic activities, the freedom to live as they wished, and their civilian armies. In essence, their experience gave us a blueprint for a positive alternative to the monocratic and aristocratic feudal systems that were the standard rule into which our founding generation was born. Our revolution was an attempt to throw off those chains and to give us a different model of government. However, in this episode, we're going to talk about different kinds of liberties and rights. Funny, but most people don't have a clear idea about rights, where they come from, or even how they're classified and why. So with that, we'll bring in Dr. Tom. Hello, Dr. Tom.
Hey, Rob. How you doing?
Very good.
Are you sure? Are you sure? Very good.
I think I am.
Okay. All right.
I'm trying.
I think you're okay, too.
It's Monday. Dr. Tom, in your book, you recount how your father, Professor Mario Giordano, or Buster as he was known, explained to you the types and meanings of rights and liberties at a young age. Before we get to that, I'd like it if you could give our audience a simple definition of a right. What is a right?
Okay, sure. A right is an intangible claim possessed by a living person, assumed by virtue of nature, tradition, or a code of law. In a more material legal sense, it is a demand, a power, a privilege, or a claim owned by a particular person by benefit of law.
You know, I happen to notice that you're using words like possessed and owned. Is there a reason you're using those?
Yes, that's right. Yes. I know that many people can't wrap their heads around ownership when dealing with an intangible. But in effect, rights and liberties are possessions, just like any other physical, tangible property. And it is important to look at them that way for very good reasons. If you own them and don't guard them, they can and will be stolen from you.
Reminds me of my time in South Philadelphia.
Yeah.
What about liberty? Are rights and liberties the same thing?
Well, they're interconnected, but they're not the same thing. By the term liberty, fundamentally, we mean freedom from arbitrary and unreasonable restraint. Now, it really implies more than just physical restraint, but also the freedom to act according to one's own will. The liberty to express your free will is one of your rights. But when you're in social boundaries or within social bounds, it's tempered so that others' rights will not be violated.
We know the term appears in the Declaration of Independence, but where does it appear in the U.S. Constitution?
Well, in the Constitution, as far as I'm aware, the term liberty appears both in the 5th and the 14th Amendments of the Constitution under the due process clauses. On a few occasions, the Supreme Court took a stab at explaining what liberty means and what it incorporates. I remember that back in 1923, there was a case out of Nebraska in which a teacher named Meyer was arrested for teaching the German language to a student. Of course, this was on the heels of World War I, and there was still a lot of anti-German sentiment. It was a perfect case for protecting due process, and the court found that his and his students' rights had been violated. Now, the court concluded that liberty denoted not merely freedom from bodily restraint, but also the right of the individual to contract, to engage in any of the common occupations of life, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry, to establish a home and bring up children, to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience, and generally to enjoy those privileges long recognized at common law as essential to the orderly pursuit of happiness by free men.
Are you saying there was a law forbidding the teaching of German?
No. It wasn't specific to German. No foreign language could be taught in Nebraska. It goes to show you that anytime there is a bad law, there is a person with a bad good intention behind it.
Well, that's Nebraska.
Well, it could be, yeah.
Okay, but not to get ahead of ourselves, can you tell our listeners what your first exposure to these concepts was and when it happened? Now, remember, I have the advantage of having read your book, so I already know the answer. But for the audience, maybe we should go into that.
Well, I was very early in my life. When I was a kid, my father spelled out the notion of the Four Liberties to me after a homework assignment in the 6th grade. Of course, given my age, it was a simplified description, but it served me pretty well until I could investigate the ideas on my own. The Four Liberties he described to me were natural, personal, civil, and political. He also described the meaning of positive and negative rights. And though I didn't write this in the book, perfect and imperfect and absolute and qualified rights as they apply to our liberties as well. From what he told me, the concept of liberty has been discussed by philosophers for as long as we have had organized societies in Europe, or let's say in the West.
Well, maybe we should dive into those categories a bit later. However, in episode 2, you established the concept of freedom that we know of today, and that came out of classical Greece, if I recall, and didn't exist elsewhere in the ancient world. You said that they took it to mean to move toward that which you love.
Well, that was the meaning of the compound word to describe the idea, but it meant much more than that. As I recall, I said that eleftheria, which was the Greek word, meant to have the free will to choose that which brings love to your soul, or being free of all attachments that weigh upon you, and that it was driven by the choices you make to create the life you desire. It also meant the absence of oppression and dependence. The Greek philosophers asserted that you can only be free when you are true to yourself, right? And this is a very, very important point. This was later assimilated by the Romans, who translated it to libertas and codified it into their civil laws. They spread the concepts to every corner of their empire. Now, you have to understand, you have to understand that these two civilizations contrasted freedoms and rights between those of the masters and those of the slaves. The master, or civilian, was defined by his liberties and free will in contradistinction to the lack thereof by the slaves that served them.
Dr. Tom, I've noticed that today we don't seem to have a clear idea of just where our liberties and rights come from. Did the ancient philosophers all agree upon the sources of our rights and freedoms?
No, not at all. No. There was a long-standing debate that continues to this day. The debate really pitted two distinct perceptions of the source of our liberties against each other. One was natural, looking at our freedoms arising from a purely natural state, unregulated by societal or governmental oversight. The other was political. This implied an outside control over the expression of our liberties for the common good. This was a codification, or a codification, I don't know how you want to pronounce it, by mutual agreement in the forms of customs, morals, and written laws based upon those societal accords. However, the problem, as always, is just who decides what that common good is. So-called good intentions may be completely self-serving, or they may be 100% sincere, but I can't think of one that hasn't ended up being catastrophic in result. Anyway, not all the Greek philosophers subscribed to the idea of natural liberty.
Is that so? I would have thought they were pretty much in agreement, but I do have to confess that every time I hear the word the common good, I get a little itchy.
Yeah, you should. You should. No. They weren't in agreement at all. Plato and Socrates argued that they argued a deference for the written law over the concept of freedom, interpreting rights and liberties as privileges founded in social and legal standards rather than natural law. Aristotle's stance has been the subject of much debate, but his views, taken up by St. Thomas Aquinas, were instituted into the Roman Catholic canons. Thankfully, these were the ones that found their way into the principles of the Enlightenment and into the convictions of the framers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. There is a long list of noted historical thinkers who have pondered over these questions. People such as Marcus Aurelius, Thomas Hobbes, the great English jurist Sir William Blackstone, Charles de Montesquieu, John Stuart Mill, Frédéric Bastiat, just to name a few. For me personally, though, I tend to primarily think, of the Scotsman John Locke as the definer of what we intend by liberty concerning the founding of our country.
I'm a little surprised that Socrates argued for a deference for the written law. His famous saying, "Own your own ignorance," seems countervailing to that, but I guess he's full of surprises.
Well, yes, but you see, you got to remember that Socrates was in Athens. And, I'm not exactly sure whether Socrates, well, let's put it this way. Had Socrates had the privilege of having a legal structure that was the rule of law, he would not have been sentenced to death. That was a how could I say this? That was a majority rule, democratic process that condemned him to death. Okay. So, he was forced to accept their sentence basically because he happened to, not to be hypocritical, he had to abide by his own, by his own convictions. So, yeah, Plato was the same thing. Plato, in his Republic, he conceded or he argued for the state of slavery. His Republic was based upon 10% of the people ruling the other 90%. So, these people, you have to understand what their environment was and who they were and what they had promulgated all of their lives. That's Socrates is a pretty interesting thing. He was an interesting character. Aristotle was quite different though. And if we look at the church, you have to understand Plato was a student of Socrates, and Aristotle was a student of Plato. So, Neoplatonism was introduced into the church, which is probably why it has the structure that it has today. It was introduced by St. Augustine. So the Republic of Plato was based upon that way, with a hierarchical structure. And that's probably why the church has the structure it has today. But Aristotle's views were a little bit different. He did acknowledge the existence of slavery. But it was, let's say, modulated compared to Plato's and Socrates' views.
All right, I suppose we should get back on track. Let's try to jump right in. And can you give us the four liberties that your dad explained and what they are? We've got to start somewhere. So I guess defining those categories would be a great first step.
Well, okay. Well, as I mentioned before, the four that he outlined to me were natural, personal, civil, and political. Now, I may use the terms liberties and rights interchangeably, so don't be confused. I mean, we tend to think of them the same way. But first, we can start with natural rights. At its simplest, these are rights which nature gives to our species to do as we wish with our persons and our property to achieve our own happiness, as long as we act within the limits of natural law and that we do not abuse them to the harm of others. They're basically in self-ownership and the idea of individual sovereignty. Now, these are expressed individually. They are actually rights each of us own by virtue of our membership in the species Homo sapiens. This is a very, very important point that we should really never forget, because these rights are species specific. They precede our conceptions and births as individuals. In effect, the rights exist before we are even conceived and arise out of the nature of the individual human being.
Yes, we had this discussion when we spoke about the abortion debate some time ago. It seems to me that the idea of our natural rights being given us just by being a member of the species Homo sapiens rather than being acknowledged only at birth really changes the argument, and not only with abortion.
Oh, you're right. It changes the argument, and it changes it in a very profound way. But we won't go there right now. But this idea has somehow either been lost or ignored for far too long. In any case, returning to these rights, the Declaration of Independence cites three of them. All right, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, there are many more, such as privacy, property ownership, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the religion, freedom to assemble, freedom of petition, and so on. There are many, many more.
You know, I was just thinking as you mentioned those that almost all of those seem to be under attack right now, but let's not get into that either.
Well, we may understand that a little bit later in the podcast, because you are touching on something that should be, let's say, that should have a light shined on it. Yes, you're right.
Dr. Tom, let's dig in a little bit more. You specified that these rights are unshackled in their pure state of nature. Where does the sense of morality come in?
Well, alone in a state of nature, there is really no sense of morality attached to our expression of our natural rights. It's only when we are among others in society do we have to concern ourselves with what we would call negative externalities or possible negative effects upon others. Excuse me. In fact, Aristotle believed that the creation of the polis was the only way for people to perfect this sense of morality in order to live in harmony with our fellow man. This is the first category of negative rights. Negative rights are those which are conditioned only by non-interference from others to express. In other words, by our very nature, we need no permission from an authority to express them.
When you say polis for our audience, you mean the city-state as it was known in ancient Greece?
Exactly, the Greek city-state.
Okay.
Right.
I get the idea of externalities, and that was something that most of us studied in economics, effects upon others in society who haven't participated in decisions which affect them, both positive and negative.
Yes, that's correct. That's right.
All right, so continue.
Okay, the second class of negative rights would be personal. Now, personal liberty deals with free will and being independent. But with respect to a person's unrestricted ability to move around or go wherever they wish. Okay. Now, remember, we're talking about an expression in a pure state of nature. Within or when you're in a societal setting, obviously you just can't walk into another's home without their permission or violate another's rights in the process. Also, we are able to express this in society as long as we're not under arrest or in prison for some crime.
As I recall, these rights actually all rights require a corresponding duty imposed on another. For example, a person who owns property and a home has a right to enjoy them without the interference of other people. It goes without saying that others are under a corresponding duty not to interfere with the owner's rights by trespassing on his property or breaking into his home.
Yes, others or agents of the government. Yes, this is just as true in the pure state of nature as it is in the civil society. The homeowner also has a right and a duty to protect his property, his home, and his possessions. And let's not also forget his family and himself from harm or death.
You say it's a duty to protect himself, not just a right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
He owes it to himself or his issue.
Being the possessor of himself, being an owner of himself, he has a duty to protect himself. Exactly. That's what, individual sovereignty is all about.
Okay, so you've just described natural and personal rights or liberties, and they're being first found in the pure state of nature. Isn't that just really anarchy? I mean, we're talking about the absence of government, right?
Yes, it is. Anarchy literally means an absence of a formal government. Nothing more, nothing less. There is nothing associated with society or social chaos, as most people today infer by the word. We could talk a little bit about anarchy a bit later. My father opened my eyes to this when I was a young man in a way that I hadn't thought of. And his observations would probably come as a shock to many, but I found them to be completely reasonable.
Okay, we'll talk about this later on. So getting back to what I was saying, these rights found in our natural existence are negative, meaning that in order to express them, all others have to do is just leave us alone, abstain from impeding us. I take this to mean that any consequences of those rights and liberties would be direct and very personal.
Oh, I would say so. Yes.
All right, let's get into the positive rights. Where are they found? Also, can negative and positive rights exist at the same time?
Well, positive rights, in a nutshell, are simply entitlements or privileges or granted liberties permitted or conceded by some higher authority. They're most often associated with the categories of civil and political rights or liberties, but they can exist in nature. Here's an example. If you have a faith in God the Creator as the grantor of our natural and personal rights, this is actually a higher order of a positive right. He is permitting you your rights, okay? It would be just as though, let's say I had a home and I own a home and I give you permission to enter my home. You entering my home is a privilege or a grant that I, as the higher authority, am granting you. So I'd say the answer to your question is yes. Positive and negative rights can exist together. They both exist at the same time, or they both can exist at the same time in nature, in society and under government oversight. Sure.
All right, maybe we should define what is civil liberty or rights, and how would you define the term?
You can think of civil liberty as natural liberty, restrained in some ways by societal accords or agreements, such as customs and traditions, or by the written laws of the land once a government is decided upon. The restraint is a general social agreement as to what is permissible to ensure equal expressions of liberties for the greater moral and physical good of the community in which people live.
So these, as I understand it, can be either written or unwritten codes, which are required to prevent people from violating natural law and yet still promote the greatest good for the public, right?
Yes, yes. Now, I have to make one thing perfectly clear. The descriptions I am about to give apply specifically to the United States as a free society envisioned by our founders, okay? Because I would like to use the United States as as what we're trying to explain here. If we start to go in other areas of the world and see what they think, they're different, because our concept of what a free society is differs from most other countries in the world. So in our case, civil rights belong to every citizen and are not connected with the organization or administration of government. They include all of our natural and personal rights, which have been outlined and codified into a law code. Okay. As such, these rights are capable of being enforced or redressed in a civil action in a government court. This is one of the major reasons that many people are under the impression that our rights come from a government. They don't. I must repeat that civil rights have no relation to the establishment, the support, or the management of the government.
All right, Tom, I'm going to ask you to restate that in another way. I think we might be losing some meaning here. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Quite simply, natural and personal rights or liberties only apply to living members of our species, not to any corporate entity that was not born into a natural world, but ratified into existence. When the founders talked about governments being formed by the consent of the governed, what they were saying is that governments have no superior rights to living people and are only able to act in our name by a set of privileges that we permit to it, which arise from our humanity and our natural and personal rights. I'm not God, and neither is the government. I just cannot grant nor take any rights. I can only grant you a privilege within my own rights. This is pure morality. Additionally, if you think about it, the government cannot even be a beneficiary of civil rights once our natural and personal rights are codified into law, because the government is not a living person to which they apply.
Well, I think I'm beginning to see what you're saying. Since all rights come from those inherited by our species, no privileges can be based upon rights, and we don't ourselves possess. Is that getting a little closer?
Sure, exactly. I can't give you what I don't own. But let's get to political rights, all right? Let's get that out of the way, because they are so simple to understand and have been so muddled that people often mistake them for civil liberties. It's not the same thing.
Okay, but I may want you to return to the ideas you've just expressed. I have to think about that a little bit.
Okay. So basically, political rights involve the power to participate either directly or indirectly in the establishment or the administration of government. This is where we get the abilities to hold citizenship, to have the right to vote, or to hold a public, or the right to hold a public office. These are positive rights. In a free society, political rights are designed to give the citizen a sense of tranquility that their persons, their natural and personal and civil rights are secure, and they have nothing to fear from others, from other citizens, from foreigners, or from their own government. I guess you could think of this as a type of freedom within secure borders where the people can enjoy their civil liberties under the Constitution, the framework, and the nature of their established government. The political liberty of a state ideally should be based upon only those indispensable laws which are set up for the distribution of legislative, executive, and judicial powers. Okay? This is all. All people within the borders of the United States, let's say, can enjoy their civil rights unless they are taken away by physical death or by a sentence of civil death. This is not the same for political rights. Aliens and non-citizens have no political rights in our country. They have no right to citizenship. They have no privilege to vote, and they are not permitted to hold public office. They do not own those rights. They can express, any kind of civil right that anybody else does, but they have no political rights, unless, of course, they go through the process of becoming a naturalized citizen. Then that's a different thing. Then they become a second-class citizen.
We need to back up a second, Dr. Tom. You mentioned a term that we've not spoken of before. What is civil death?
Oh, you've never heard of civil death?
I've heard of dead people voting here in Philadelphia, but not civil death.
Exactly. Well, civil death is a concept in law, and it's on the books in the United States. It is the forfeiture of civil and political rights and privileges of anybody who has been convicted of a serious crime. All right. And as I said, the statute is on the books in some states, I believe at the federal level as well. A person can be declared civilly dead by a judge of a competent tribunal. As such, the person against whom that sentence is pronounced is considered dead.
Tom, if that's the case, how come criminals, murderers are not declared civilly dead at their sentencing? Is that just what they?
Oh, they are.
That they're considered that, not called that.
They are. A person condemned to death is considered civilly dead before he's even executed. Even people waiting on death row or have been put in prison for life, they are civilly dead. Their personal, natural, and civil rights have been denied them. They've been stripped of them. But they're still alive until they are executed. But I mean, it is a civil.
Now, how can
death.
a person be alive and dead at the same time?
Okay. It does sound absurd, doesn't it? Well, look, you have to understand that when the legal authorities take our natural and personal rights and codify them into a law code, they are creating a fictional state of existence that imitates and runs concurrently with the real state of existence. You and I, as natural persons, have a sort of avatar in the form of a legal person in the legal world from birth. In other words, we got two things running at the same time. As such, you can be declared dead in the fictional legal world, even though you're very much alive in the real world. This is among some of the things that we should be very fearful of when setting up civil and political rights.
This is a strange idea to me.
Well, I know it sounds absurd, but it is actually the case. Where do you think Social Security numbers come from? How about birth and death certificates and identification cards with expiration dates? This goes all the way back to the days of Rome. The legal status of a person is reflected in the way their natural names are written.
Exactly how is that, Dr. Tom?
Well, it's among us even today. Well, this is going to sound really strange, but
it's already sounding strange.
Yeah, I know. But believe me, I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat. These are concepts in law, and they exist. You can most obviously see this in the court's admiralty, but it's not so obvious under common law. It is referred to as capitis diminutio. Okay, nice Latin term, capitis diminutio. It is where a person's diminishing legal and civil status is indicated by the way his name is written. There are basically three types of legal personhood. In Latin, they are capitis diminutio minima, capitis diminutio media, and capitis diminutio maxima. Now, the word diminutio is taken to mean a loss or a deprivation. So there is minimum, medium, and maximum loss.
This sounds, Tom, like it's going to get a bit complicated. Should I run for the door? I think most people, they'd be happy to walk away rather than to try to follow legal Latinese legal, Latin legalese.
Latin legalese, right? Yeah, you're probably right, but but not as much as I would rather run to the door instead of explaining it.
Okay, well, let's go get a beer then. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. I think maybe by the end of this, you might need a whiskey.
All right, so explain, go on. Tell me about capitis diminutio or whatever.
Diminutio. Remember, yes. Capitis diminutio indicates the loss of status through the use of capitalization of the letters of a person's name. Okay, this is how they would know just by reading your name what your legal and let's say your legal, your civil, and your political status is. Capitis diminutio minima is the minimal or least inclusive degree of loss of status. This would usually happen when the man's family relationship changed. Okay. Typically it was applied to a son who was emancipated by his family, his father. That would be his paterfamilias. He would leave that and go on his own. So his rights to liberty and citizenship, as far as the state goes, remained the same. It was intact, but his family rights would be altered. They would change. Okay. His natural name would be written, let's say it was Tom Giordano. It was my name. It would be written with a capital T for Tom and a capital G for Giordano. Okay. So I have a capital, my initials would be capitalized. Basically, that would be it. And the rest of it would be in lowercase. When a person loses his citizenship or his political rights, but not his liberty, this would be capitis diminutio media, or a lesser or medium loss of status. His natural name would be written the same. It would be written normally. Capital, the first letter would be capitalized. The rest would be okay. But his natural surname would be written in all capital letters. So in my case, Giordano would be written in all caps, right? So it would be Tom Giordano, okay? But the worst case was capitis diminutio maxima. This was the highest or the complete loss of status. This happens when a man's condition is changed from freedom to bondage. When he becomes a slave, it eliminates all of his rights of citizenship and all of his family rights. His entire name would be written in all capital letters. Okay?
My God, who would think this kind of stuff up?
Well, I'm telling you, it's a real phenomena. It's a real phenomenon when we are talking about the consequences of codifying natural and personal rights into written laws. This parallel identity that I spoke about earlier, that each of us has, places all of our natural, unalienable inheritances in serious jeopardy.
Well, I've never heard anything like this before, but if it's true, I guess it would clarify a lot of incongruities that I'm beginning to see around me.
Well, not many people have heard about it, but don't believe me. Just look up the terms in Black's Law Dictionary. And I'm talking about a law dictionary before they've been modified by let's say, progressivism. Go to Black's dictionary. It would have been the closest dictionary to our founders, even though it was in the latter part of the 1800s. But it would seem that somewhere along the line, the corporate structure called the United States of America got itself into debt. I'm not really sure of these concepts, but excuse me, the only thing I could think of is that natural persons had to be converted into legal persons to create an inventory of collateral assets to guarantee that debt. Now, like I said, I'm not really sure of this, and I'm going to have to do some serious research into the matter. But it all starts with a registration of a birth certificate, which is why our U.S. code defines life as starting at birth. The birth certificate apparently forces a natural person to volunteer himself into slavery or bondage through the forming of a legal joinder with the new identity or legal fiction whose legal name is written in all capital letters. Okay? Now, I don't believe most rational people would willingly, that would willing to enter into this kind of a situation. I mean, it's so this immoral and also unlawful, I may add, but legal reductionist joinder is entered into dishonestly and by deception. In any case, as I said, our birth certificates create an incorporated legal personhood that runs parallel and concurrently with our natural personhood. It effectively turns our natural and personal rights as natural persons into conditional privileges and entitlements of a legal person. What I mean to say is that what is unalienable in a natural society has become alienable in a government-controlled society. The combination confounds the truth of our existence.
Alienable meaning able to be sold or transferred.
Exactly.
You've got to be pulling my leg. This can't be true. It's a little scary. And I always thought that the birth certificate was evidence of your citizenship.
Well, it is. It is. But it's also evidence. What's the second thing that you get issued? A social security number. Wow. Rob, listen, if the government can declare you civilly dead by a court sentence, you don't think they can turn you into a civil slave as an undeclared condition of citizenship? All right, let's do a little test, okay? Just for the sake of argument. Do you have any correspondences with the government or a bank or any other business? They're near you. How about a credit card, a driver's license, or a property deed? Pull them out and look.
All right, here. I'm pulling out my driver's license right now.
Okay. Tell me how your name is written.
It's all caps, Robert Melso.
Exactly. Now look at any other look at any correspondence from a bank. Tell me how
my address is in caps too.
Yeah, well that doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with that. Look at your name. Look at your name. That's the important thing. All right. Look at a credit card.
All right. Here's one. All caps.
There you go. Do you have any correspondences that came to you from the government? Let's say a traffic ticket or, whatever, any kind of thing from the IRS.
Here, let me look up something from my parole officer. Now, here's a telephone bill with Robert Melso.
Yep. And is it all caps?
Yes.
Yes, because you are a corporate entity. Don't you understand? So that's how people are confused in society. They say, how can the government tread upon my natural and personal rights with such reckless abandon? It's because they're not doing it to you as a natural person. They're doing it to you as a legal person. So therein lies the problem. Therein lies the problem. That's why the things that the government does with respect to the founding principles seems completely schizophrenic. And then we got to go to a court, the Supreme Court, to determine what our rights are. And the Supreme Court's not looking at natural rights. They have nothing to do with the Supreme Court's authority. The Supreme Court's authority is only to see whether or not your rights are being violated with respect to what is written in the Constitution.
Okay, let's get back to the idea of positive rights. I think we better leave this set aside for just a minute.
I know it sounds like it's some kind of a conspiracy and all that, but I'm not saying yes or no. All I'm saying is that with my research, this is what I have come up with, and it can be easily documented by looking at definitions in law.
All right. Well,
Look up the law. Look up. Capitis diminutio in Black's law. Look up civil death in any legal dictionary. You will see that what I'm saying is accurate. Okay. Now, getting back to the idea of positive rights.
yes. Why are some governments founded in different ideologies seemingly more brutal than others? In fact, most of them are brutal. But what I mean to say is there are many different types of governments around the world and through history in which people's will has had no influence, as well as the opposite. What can you tell us about the formations of government generally?
Oh, well, we have a lot of history to call upon, as examples. Firstly, Rob, look, we have to recognize one simple concept. There are only two forms of government, regardless of what they're called, regardless of what ideology is behind them. The first one is where the people control the government. And the second is where the government controls the people. That's it. There's no other form unless, we could even talk about anarchy, but anarchy is the lack of a government. So the only two formal governments are what I just stated. The only real distinction is whether that formal government is fashioned morally or immorally.
Okay, explain morally or immorally.
Well, whether it came about voluntarily and passively in a spontaneous manner, or as a bloody reaction to aggression or violence from a previous government, or simply in aggression. What I'm trying to say is human history is really quite clear. Not all governments are instituted as the result of violence and bloodshed, but they all end that way. Right? Additionally, what we have learned in history is that any government that actually does begin through violence and bloodshed is guaranteed to end that way. How a government is formed is always determined by the conditions of the society preceding the institution, and this will always determine how natural and personal rights are prioritized.
If I'm understanding you correctly, you're implying that a government that comes into being as a result of, say, conquest or a violent overthrow or led by a destructive ideology or a coup d'etat, in other words, immorally, will always fail. And that conversely, all governments which arise in a free society, let's say for protection or defense of a people and their natural and personal rights, they're morally grounded. Is that the case? Is that what you're saying?
Oh yes, absolutely. And I could cite hundreds of governments that were founded with bloodshed and that failed, because eventually the people will rise up simply because of the abrogation of their rights. Yes. Now, this is not to imply that a morally founded government isn't subject to a bloody destruction by an immoral aggression. Okay. It just means that it has a better chance of surviving if the people are tranquil and secure in their persons, their properties, and their rights and their liberties. When I think about humanity and governments, for some reason, I always think of Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. The one that talks about beating swords into plowshares and spears into sickles. You know that one?
Yes,
Right?
I'm familiar.
Okay. This simple idea tells us that governments can either drip off of the blade of a sword and at the point of a spear, or they can take root from the plow and the sieve.
So what you're saying, of course, is that the sword and the spear represent violence and the plow and the sickle represent peace. I take this to mean that you're saying that any government formed from the ground up in peace and for defense will prioritize our natural and personal rights as primary and foundational, whereas perhaps any government forced upon a people at the point of a sword will do exactly the opposite. It will limit severely, perhaps even eliminate those negative rights in favor of positive rights or privileges. And they'll do that to maintain the status quo of their government control, as they always do.
Yep. That says it in a nutshell. As far as the reasons behind creating a government go, my father once told me that truth is the only valid ideology to follow in forming a government. Truth. Do you remember what I told you about the ancient Greek philosophers asserting that you had to be true to yourself in order to be free? That people can only be free if they are true to themselves. My father once told me that ideologies are like those funhouse mirrors that distort the truth. They're only fun and appealing for a short while. Then you've got to go home. So any delusional ideology that is based in destruction, theft, and denial of our rights is destined to fail in a pool of blood.
Oh, that's ugly. So we can only set up governments with varying degrees of control over the governed from minimal to total. I would think that in that case, the barometer that would be the expression of our natural and personal rights. Am I correct in going there?
Yes, exactly. That is the barometer. The freer the society, the more natural and personal rights are able to be expressed. The more oppressed the society, the less, well, you don't even have them. You only have, you have varying degrees of privileges granted to you by a higher authority in government. All right. They are either created guaranteeing our rights and liberties or by stealing them from us and turning them into privileges and entitlements. Unfortunately, even direct vote, majority rule democracies can be just as brutal as outright authoritarian dictatorships. I mean, if you think about it, there is no reason in mobthink. There's no intellectual reflection. There's no consideration of morality. It is an odd human characteristic to allow ourselves to be led around, by the nose without really knowing just who is directing us and what their motives are. It is what leads us to crucify our messiahs and follow the person most likely to march us to our own deaths.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about politicians today claiming this or that as a threat to our democracy. Yet, as you and I know, democracy wasn't a word even used in our Constitution, and the founders actually feared it because it can be mobocracy, it can be brutal.
Right. They know it.
But that's a pretty profound and frightening observation. What about, let's get back to anarchy. Now, when I hear the word anarchy, I think of lawlessness and complete chaos. But you mentioned earlier that your father had some observations that would come as a shock. What are they?
Well, Robert, you're not alone. I mean, I used to believe the same thing, because people have, like many other things, they kept the word and changed the definition. I once asserted to my father that any government was preferable to no government. And he asked me why I thought so. And I found I was confusing anarchy, which merely means the absence of a formal government, with social chaos and mob rule or vigilantism, or let's say violence in a society. He reminded me that societies had no need for government to maintain good order. He cited the California gold rush and the not so wild West. He reminded me that there were only 11 bank robberies in the Western U.S. territories from the end of the Civil War until the first or second decades of the early 1900s. He also asked me two questions which struck me. I mean, really struck me.
Well, 11 bank robberies. Let me think. Those were probably done by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, all of them.
No, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid didn't do that. They robbed trains. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they went on the banks in Bolivia. But
yeah, they tried because they weren't, trains weren't. But, think of trying to rob a bank.
All right.
You could rob the bank, but think of trying to run away up Main Street with 200 armed citizens.
Well, it didn't bode too well for them in the end of the movie, but
no. So they didn't even think about robbing banks because the citizens would have defended themselves. And in the California Gold Rush, there was no formal government in 1849 until 1850 when they founded when they ratified the Constitution of the Republic of California. I mean, there were no laws. There was no criminality because there were no laws, and people took care of themselves. And there was an absolute respect for people's property.
All right, getting back to the two questions that Buster asked you, what were they?
Oh yeah. Well, he asked me if I had ever heard of an anarchy that took away people's natural and personal liberties with a threat of violence. Then he asked me if I had ever heard of an anarchy declaring war on another people. So I sat there and I understood that he was right. I came away thinking that the best form of formal government, was one that was as close to anarchy as we could possibly construct. And that if I were given the choice between anarchy and any form of government based in Marxist or leftist ideologies, I would choose anarchy every day of the week.
Yeah, you might not feel that way if you're being invaded by another country, but who would they invade? I mean, really, if you don't have a formal government.
Yeah, exactly.
So what we're saying is that the government that governs best governs least, that old saying.
Yeah, precisely. You see, Jefferson and the rest knew that men were corruptible. You cannot force any person to be virtuous. So the division of powers and the checks and balances were an absolute necessity when they formed our government, if we were to protect and guarantee our natural and personal rights, along with our civil and political liberties, right? They didn't even trust the word of those drafting the document and forced them to come up with the Bill of Rights by the amendment process. They knew that the 16 privileges granted to the government by the people had to be strictly enumerated. They also knew that there would inevitably be overreach by those in government, men being what they are. This is what Franklin meant by, if you can keep it, madam. That's what he meant.
All right. Let's sort of wrap this up. Just tell me what you mean. Tell me your definition of the role of government in a free society.
Oh, well, the role of government, the purpose of government, of forming a government in a free society, is one purpose. That is to protect our lives and to assure that our liberties are maintained. That's it. And it does this by three different functions. All right. One is to wage war against aggression, against aggressive acts of outsiders, of foreigners. All right. The other is to wage peace. Now, when I say wage peace, I mean to maintain a peace internally within our borders. And that's basically to protect me from you. It's to protect the citizen from other citizens. That's why we have courts of law. That's the function of courts of law. And the third is basically to make sure that there is a level playing field for commerce. That's it. That's the only role for government. It's not there to tell you, what kind of pillowcase you can have. It's not there to tell you what kind of that you have to have a roof over your head. It's not there to tell you that what shoes you can wear any of the things that it's morphed into today. It has nothing to do with that. Those are all the roles of society. They have nothing to do with government. Okay? And that's the only purpose of a government, to make sure that your life and your limb are protected, and to make sure that your rights and liberties are guaranteed. And that's it. Like I said, there's no other role for it.
All right. Well, Dr. Tom, I want to thank you. That about wraps up this podcast.
Oh, thank you, Rob.
And we are going to be talking in the next version about crime.
Okay.
And we are going to surprise our audience a little bit with this one, as if we didn't with the one we just did.
Yeah, right. We're both wearing, the people walk away from this thing thinking, hey, these guys are crazy. He's wearing wearing an aluminum hat, man.
Well,
yeah, that gamma radiation, man.
We're going to talk about crime as it revolves around theft, and that crime is actually the basis for the need for societies to form. So, in the meantime, thank you, Dr. Tom, and we'll see you next podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.